If there's anything I've learned from interviewing and sharing stories from park rangers all across the country, it's that they see some of the weirdest and strangest things that you could imagine in the woods. Welcome back to the swamp, my friends. It's good to see that you made it back for another episode. This is by far my favorite series on the channel, and as I can tell from the comments, it's a lot of yours as well. Today we're going to be sharing some fresh, new park ranger stories that were sent in by viewers just like you. If you have a story that you would like to share in a future video, be sure to submit yours at swampdweller.net or the email you can find in the description down below. I would love to share your story with everyone here in the swamp, and stories like yours help keep this show going. Before we get into these truly terrifying park ranger stories, I just wanted to take a moment to introduce you to the multi-award winning podcast, The Magnus Archives. The Magnus Archives is a weekly horror fiction anthology podcast examining what lurks in the archives of the Magnus Institute, an organization dedicated to researching the esoteric and the weird. Join new head archivist Jonathan Sims as he attempts to bring a seemingly neglected collection of supernatural statements up to date, converting them to audio and supplementing them with follow-up work from his small but dedicated team. Individually, they are unsettling. Together, they begin to form a picture that is truly horrifying, because as they look into the depths of the archives, something starts to look back. With over 160 episodes, I have been deeply enthralled by this captivating series. It is one of the most popular horror podcasts in the world for a reason. Check out the Magnus Archives everywhere you listen to podcasts, or go to rustyquill.com. Out in the parks of Montana, we've had people go missing in my time working with the park rangers. My name is Nate, and I'm going to tell you about these mysterious disappearances. I don't have any way to know how or why they are missing. I can only say that they are missing, and it is rather strange due to the circumstances. I'm going to keep this somewhat short, but these people all seem to go missing from the same area of our park. We aren't sure if they are being snatched up or sold or what's going on, but there are some bad dealings that happen in this area from time to time. We also can't rule out the possibility that maybe they're simply running away. In fact, we've never figured out anything in relation to these cases, as there seems to be nothing to go on. The earliest one I can remember was a 7-year-old girl who went missing with her family. They went into the park and never came out again. I remember the girl simply because she was a child, and as a dad myself, that makes things like these hit a bit differently. Police and our park ranger services certainly looked for this family, but it's as though they went into the woods and then just disappeared. The second disappearance was a college-aged couple. Just like the family a few years before them, they went into the woods and never came out again. There are a few people who claim they believe there's a cult operating out in the area, but we've never seen anything that could verify that theory. I know stranger things happen, but it's a bit unnerving to think people could just disappear like that. I often find myself pondering what happens to people who go missing, not just in our area, but in general. The third disappearance happened late at night in 2010, I believe, if memory serves me correctly, and it was a rather fit man in his 40s who went into the woods and did not come out again. Now, some witnesses in the area at the time did say they heard someone shouting for help, and they went into the woods towards the sounds of the voice, but eventually, the voice faded, and they never found anyone. They were the people who reported the man missing before his family came forward. The final disappearance, and probably the most disturbing sounding one, involved a woman in her 30s who went out late one night much like the man who previously disappeared. She was heard screaming. Another man went into the woods and said he felt shaken and uncomfortable. It was shortly after he found a flashlight that was later identified as having belonged to the missing woman. I believe something very dark is happening out there, but the problem is, where is any real evidence of what happened to the missing? I've debated going in on my off time looking over the area, but I've never worked up the nerve. I know this isn't a super disturbing story, as we have no way to actually know what happened to these individuals, but it is something I wanted to share, if for no other reason than as a warning to always be careful, even in state parks, if traveling off the beaten path, and even on the normal ones. I'm a park ranger out of Mississippi, and in the swampier areas we see gators. Now, most people realize there are gators out there, but I want to talk about something else. Something far larger. I'm talking about a ridiculously large gator out in the swamps of Mississippi. Now, I've been working with the rangers for a long time, but in my free time, I like to go swamping, as I like to call it. I like to explore the lovely nature of the swamp on my off time. I've seen many a gator out there, but one evening, I saw something I could not believe. And I guess I wouldn't have ever believed it myself if I hadn't seen it. And I understand if you don't believe it, as it really is something that you have to see. So, I'm boating around in the swamps when I hear something. I'm like, okay, it's probably a gator or something out that way. So I think nothing of it, and I just keep putting along, enjoying my evening. It isn't long before I see an opossum chilling out in a tree. Now, I pay little mind, other than to glance at it, when I suddenly feel something slam into the side of my boat, and it damn near flipped me off the thing. After settling, I look up and see this large gator chomp on the opossum. I have never seen anything like that. And the scariest part is after that happened, it submerged. Its tail straight up hit my boat. Keep in mind, it was already a few feet from my boat after slamming it, so it must have been massive. I remember starting my boat up and turning tail and getting the hell out of Dodge. I know it sounds silly. If you would have seen it though, you'd have turned white as a ghost. When I finally made it out of the swamp, I remember my legs shaking and having taken a moment to calm myself down. Since this happened, I haven't gone back into the swamp. No sir, I am a happy landman now. I'm not about to get chomped by some large gators that shouldn't exist. Nope, not at all. Anyway, I know this was on the shorter side, but I thought I'd give you all a heads up to be careful, cause them gators can get real big. And just for size reference, this gator easily was as big as Gustav if you've ever heard the legend of him. I know most people won't believe it, but this thing was massive. My name is Pamela, and back in 2003, I'm fairly certain I saw a legend walking our parks. We get a lot of animals around the area. It's a park, you expect that sort of thing. But on one particular evening, we had experienced something unexpected. It started with a rancher phoning us about livestock he'd lost. Apparently, one of his cattle had gone missing, and being it was near the area, he called to ask whether we'd seen it wandering around by chance. I answered the call and explained to him we had not seen any livestock in the area, but that we'd look around and be sure his cattle hadn't escaped onto the park somehow. I remember laughing at the thought, but still taking the matter seriously while on the line. After I hung up, I explained to my boss the situation, and he said we could go looking. It was a Friday, and we had time to kill before the end of the shift anyway, so he didn't see any harm in looking for a rogue cow. I remember how lighthearted everyone was about it, and how we were all making jokes. Well, time went on, and we found nothing. So, we phoned the rancher and said we hadn't seen his cattle, but if we did, we'd contact him again. But if we didn't contact him, it meant we simply never saw any cattle. He thanked us for searching anyway, and said he'd call if his cattle turned up, so we weren't aimlessly looking forever. I remember going home and sleeping as I volunteered to work on Saturday. Well, Saturday morning comes around and I roll into work early. It was still dark out, and as I step out of my truck, I hear a loud mooing. I smiled and went over to where I heard the sound. and as I got closer to the mooing, it got more intense, I guess you could say. I was a little lost as to why that would be, but in order to make sure the cattle was okay, I figured I'd hurry up, as the last thing I wanted to do was tell the rancher we found dead cattle at the park. As I approach, suddenly this cow comes rushing out and almost hits me. It slams into my truck and falls over, and I'm about to go over and try to calm it down when something darts by me really fast. This thing leaps faster and sinks its teeth into the cow. I'm all sorts of lost, but I rush over. To my horror, this thing turns around and sort of hisses at me, if you can call it that. It is very hard to describe the sound, but this thing looked like a weird cat or dog. Hard to say. Mixed with a rat. It was kind of small. It took me a second before it hit me that what this thing was, or at least I believed it to be. This was a chupacabra. I know how crazy that sounds, and you can laugh all you want. I'm 99.9% positive that is what this thing was. To wrap this up, and not drone on, the thing darted off into the woods shortly after this, and I never saw or heard from it ever again. I called to the rancher who came by and picked up his cow. The cow had lost some blood, but it was overall fine, and it lived. I didn't know what to say about the thing, the bite marks and everything. I just told the rancher what I saw. They seemed concerned, but they didn't seem to think I was crazy. I guess they were strong believers in such things themselves as they grew up with urban legends. After the weekend came to an end, I talked to my boss about it and he simply laughed. He said he's sure I saw something, but he wasn't convinced it was a chupacabra. He can say what he wishes, but I'm positive I saw this thing, and I'm certain that it does exist. My name is Donnie, and I worked with park services in Utah for 20 years before retiring. One of the weirdest things I've ever come across is a kid. Now, I know what you're going to think, and I know you're going to say that this is weird, but I can tell you now, this is no normal happening. It was the summer of '94, when I met a kid that would play in our park. When I first met her, I asked if she had any parents around, as I was concerned about her wandering around aimlessly, even if our parks were well monitored and generally safe. When I'd do this, she would say they didn't live far away, and she was headed home shortly anyway. In the '90s though, stranger danger was becoming a thing. It wasn't entirely unheard of for kids to go around the neighborhood and play or hang out, even in parks. Generally though, if this was happening there, was either a parent or somebody nearby. At the very least, there was a large group of kids, and this girl looked like she was no older than 7. Anyway, the first time she left when I offered to phone her home. The second time, though, she seemed a bit more distraught. She kept saying she was looking for her dog, which she called Macy. She said it was a golden retriever, and that it had gotten out of their yard and run off toward the park. I offered to help find her dog, so long as she stuck with me. I also asked her if her parents knew that she was out here. She said no. As this happened when she was playing in the backyard, she was worried she could be in trouble if her parents found out. This seemed a normal concern for a child, but in an effort to be sure she was in a safe living situation, I asked her if her parents were nice. She told me yes, they were very loving, and they treated her like a princess. I remember the smile on her face, and I felt reassurance at this. I asked if once we found Macy, I could walk her back to meet her parents. She agreed, but seemed hurried as she was fixated on finding her dog. We spent a large part of the day searching for Macy, but eventually gave up. This girl told me she wanted to go home and talk to her parents, so I of course obliged and walked her to her house. It was around the time we were getting closer, as she put it, that I grew a bit concerned. The only thing down the way we were headed, to my knowledge, was an old farmhouse, well out of the way, and as far as I know, no one lived there. I asked the girl what her name was, because she had never given it to me. She said that her name was Kaylee. I then asked her where she lived. She told me on the farm. I asked her if she'd moved there recently, to which she replied she'd lived here her whole life. I didn't want to doubt the girl, but I felt a hesitation growing within me. The more she told me about herself, I tried to shrug this off and decided I'd take her the rest of the way home. When we arrived at home, there was only the farmhouse. It looked decrepit and abandoned, and I turned the girl around and asked her if this was really her home. She smiled and said yes, very matter of fact. I was confused and a bit worried about the girl when suddenly I heard barking. Kaylee turned around and ran toward the sound. A golden retriever appeared and she yelled, "Macy!" before giving it a big hug. The girl thanked me for helping her, and it was nice meeting me. She began to walk off and I asked her to wait. She turned with a smile and she told me, "It's okay, my parents will meet me here shortly. They're at the store." Perplexed and concerned, I told her I'd wait here until they arrived. She told me she'd be fine and turned and walked toward the house. I tried to stop her, but to my shock, when she and her dog Macy hit the steps of the porch, they vanished. I remember stopping and jumping back a bit. I remember being very confused and very shaken. Then after a while, I walked up to the steps and went onto the porch. I called out for Kaylee or Macy, but I never received a response. I searched the house up and down and never saw any of them. Very shaken, I left. I began searching town records over the next few days to find anything I could on a Macy or a Kaylee. I found nothing at all about either of them. The family that lived in that farmhouse previously had no relation that I can tell to either of these two, and I was left with a very confused feeling. I've never seen either Kaylee or her dog, Macy, ever again. I'm convinced I met two ghosts, but Kaylee seemed so real up until the moment she vanished. And if they were ghosts, I've never heard of ghosts haunting a place they had no previous connection to. What do you guys think? I've been with the park rangers in Alaska for about 30 years. I'm getting ready to retire in a few months' time. Alaska is an amazingly beautiful state. In many ways, it is far different from the rest of the United States. There is a lot more wilderness and things that are still quite wild. Nature is much more prevalent and things are a lot more rural. If you've ever wanted to live in a place without a lot of neighbors, Alaska has plenty of places just for you. Anyway, my story starts in 1996. We got a call about a missing person. Now, we get the occasional missing person, and that's not unusual by any means, especially out in the wilds of Alaska. But this was a bit more pressing as the missing person wasn't an Alaskan resident. The person was a woman who was supposed to have come to visit some family. They were due out a week prior to return, but the family hadn't heard from her. I reassured the woman that there was a strong chance she was probably already back, but she hadn't checked in. Considering this was a younger woman, I thought maybe she was just enjoying her freedom, so to speak, as that wasn't very uncommon. Still, I told her we'd take things into consideration and we would look into things and let her know what we found. The first thing I did was head over and check in with the family this woman was supposed to be visiting. I was quite of the belief that the missing woman had already headed out of Alaska and gone back to New York where she lived, but I figured I should just check anyway, as if it were my kid, I want to know where their whereabouts were as well. It took some time to get where I was headed, as travel isn't always the most convenient out here in Alaska. Upon my arrival, I knocked on the door of this girl's aunt and explained the situation. I asked some simple questions, and it was then I grew a little bit more worried than I'd initially been. This girl's aunt was very welcoming and gracious, and while I was appreciative of this, she informed me quickly that she hadn't seen her niece since she left a week ago to go back home. I had a cup of coffee and thanked the woman before reassuring her I'd check in with the pilot who flew her out, and I'd get back to her. It wasn't long before I headed that way. While I was a bit more worried, I fully expected to hear from the pilot, and they'd flown her out to the nearest airport outside of Alaska. It was all okay. This theory was great and all except for one thing. Upon heading to where this pilot lived, I found something quite suspicious. A door covered in red. I'm not talking painted red. I'm talking a blood spray sort of red. I pounded on the door and announced myself several times, but I got no answer. I peeked around the residence and found what looked like to be more blood. I began following the trail, and there were points where I saw claw marks dug into the side of the cabin this pilot lived in. Eventually, I happened upon a broken window around the back. I took my flashlight and looked inside a bit and noticed there was blood absolutely everywhere. It was at this point I called the nearest authorities. I explained everything to them, and it was here the real investigation began. Inside the cabin was a horrid smell. The authorities had found bits and pieces of this pilot throughout the cabin. A head there, an arm here, blood and entrails just about everywhere. It was sickening, to say the least. It was possible the girl had been in the area, but it had been too long to know for sure. I decided to head back to the airstrip the pilot would have flown out from and found almost nothing to authenticate what had happened or if the girl had ever even been there. My initial thought was she had to have been there. Still, there wasn't much to go on and the trail was fairly non-existent. Having nothing much to go on, I headed back to my own station and informed all the family members of the goings-ons. Mostly, we'd continue searching, and that it appeared that she was indeed missing. I obviously didn't let them know the details of the pilot or anything they didn't need to know. A day turned to a week, which was a month later, and we hadn't really found anything. There was nothing on what had happened to the girl or why the pilot had been mauled or by what. Most of the law enforcement seemed to assume it was a wild animal, but I didn't think as much. I'd never seen a wild animal force its way into someone's home and then just proceed to eviscerate them completely. Sure, sometimes you'll get a wild animal that gets a little too wild, but the level of which the person has been massacred didn't make much sense. Also, it didn't seem like whatever mauled the pilot ate anything. The person was in pieces, sure, but if it were an animal, you'd think it would have feasted on some of it, if not all of it. Also, the claw marks were deep, and none of them seemed to match any kind of animal we had here in Alaska. The eeriest part of all this was that whatever attacked the pilot seemed to have done so with intelligence and almost cold calculation. There are plenty of smart animals out there, but the pilot was able to get their gun off to fire several shots in the process somehow. Whatever attacked him had somehow avoided these things. You'd have to be pretty fast to do something like that. I don't know a human or an animal that could avoid being shot at that close of range and get close enough to rip someone to pieces while that person is firing a shotgun right in front of them. Not a single part of this sat well with me, but there wasn't much I was able to do because I had little to nothing to go on. Looking back now, I wish this would have just been the end, honestly. I mean, no disrespect to the family or the girl or the pilot, but what happened next was more than I could have ever bargained for, if you catch my drift. I was home one night, about a couple of months after the investigation, when I heard a faint call for help. I was in my chair, fire going and doors locked. Because of the nature of the snow that was falling, I initially thought the wind was playing tricks on my mind, as it was storming pretty hard out there. This quickly changed upon the sound of a loud pounding on my door. I jumped, nearly spilling my hot cocoa all over myself, and I quickly shouted a few obscenities before grabbing my gun and asking who was there. I heard nothing in response, and I decided to check what could be out on the other side of that peephole. It was then I was shocked to see a blonde girl in her 20s covered in blood, crying outside my door. I quickly unlocked my door and swung it open, looking to help this girl, but upon opening the door, I saw no one. I was thrown off by this, especially when I shut the door, locked it again, took 2 steps before the pounding started again. I looked at the peephole again, but as I did, my power died for a moment. I felt shaky, and I couldn't see the best. I swore for a moment I heard the sound of faint sniffling and crying, but it was only for a second when the power came back on. This was normal, the blizzard being what it was. The thing that wasn't normal, however, was what happened next. I heard persistent knocking like something was blowing in the wind at my door. This was quite different from the pounding I had heard initially. Looking through the peephole, I saw a rope. Inside this rope was a bloody trash bag. I flipped out and called the police. The entire time I waited, I could hear the bag hitting the door. When law enforcement arrived, they found remains of a woman. It matched the idea of that missing woman that we were investigating. This poor girl had been torn to pieces. It looked like someone had ripped her spine out of her body and had a grand old time tearing the rest of her body piece by piece. This wasn't natural and it wasn't normal. I was shaken, to say the least. Something was out there and it left me this girl, which meant it knew where I lived and that I had looked into the disappearances. The next few nights I had were sleepless. Part of this was from the guilt of the way this girl was found, and part of this was from the horror of that same thing. What little sleep I did get came with nightmares and disturbing chantings inside my mind. I'd hear several minutes upon waking. In time, this slowly stopped. It was a year later before things got really strange again. I'd somewhat moved on from the previous year's events, as much as anyone could after something like that, when I got a call to the station. It was something crying and trying to speak, but it was breaking up quite a bit. After several attempts to calm this person down, the line died, abruptly. I decided to check around at the phone stations around the park and see if I could find anything. It was around the time I hit one of our most remote stations that I knew something was up. I found a blood-soaked handprint that seemed to streak. The phone line had been ripped out in the phone, and there was a trail of blood that led deeper into the woods. I called law enforcement and gave them my location before slowly making my way, gun in hand, down the blood-soaked snow trail. It wasn't long before I found myself face to face with a fresh body, or half of one, that is. A man was pinned to a tree by a branch that was driven through its mouth. His top half was... it was there, but where his bottom half should have been, there was only blood and some of his insides, which were steaming in the snow. It was here I stopped and waited for the authorities to arrive. I wasn't even slightly comfortable at this point, and I quite honestly wanted nothing to do with the continuing of this investigation. I didn't exactly have a choice, however, as this happened at my park and I was beginning to think it was done intentionally. Afraid for my life, I didn't dare move an inch till the police arrived. I told them everything I had found and what little I knew, and they eventually found the rest of the man a mile away. I went home and tried to sleep, but I didn't get much at all. I called in and took some time off, which was easy to do since I was the lead at the station. During my time off, I'd get strange nightly phone calls. The first time, it was the voice of the man who'd called me right before his death. I still get chills thinking about how the voice sounded exactly like the man. I swore it was his dying moments replayed again. The thing is though, an audio recording back then would have been obvious. This was no audio recording. It was either the dead man's ghost or something that mimicked his last moments perfectly. The second night I got a call, and it was just snickering on the other line. I threatened to call law enforcement and told whoever was on the other end of this line exactly what they could do to themselves if they catch my drift. Night 3 was several varying phone calls from 2 to 4 in the morning. They were all different and all on the hour. One was a woman crying. The 3 a.m. call was a child asking for his mother over and over again. And the final call for the night was a repeat of the man who'd been mauled at our park. I called the authorities, but they couldn't do much about it. The 4th night was an almost demonic or extremely warped voice. I couldn't understand it at all. And night 5 was someone whispering, "I see you," before hanging up. This call really unnerved me. The reason being was the strange wailing that came from outside my window after it happened. I peeked out the curtains and saw nothing, but I was uncomfortable the remainder of the night. I'd even taken to recording the calls so I could share them with law enforcement. Again, there was nothing they could really do about it. Night 6's call was an older woman begging for help and screaming at what sounded like her slowly being murdered. and night 7 was just heavy breathing. As tired as I was, I wanted to get back to somewhat of a normal routine after this, and went back to work the next morning. I was convinced at this point that something was stalking me. I thought it'd be the best to take advantage of this knowledge to set up traps of sorts, assuming I could catch whatever it was. I clocked out at the end of the workday and locked up. I then proceeded to wait at my station. I wasn't going to go home. I figured if something was stalking me, I'd meet it here, at my work. So, I loaded up my shotgun and my Magnum and proceeded to wait. It was about 11ish when I heard a loud pounding at my station door. I asked who was there, and it was then I heard laughter from behind me. I looked and saw blood on the window. The shape looked like a 3-fingered hand. This was followed by a large thud on the roof above me. I cautiously sat down and waited. I wasn't looking to be baited out. I wouldn't need to be. However, as I heard a loud smack hit the station window, oh my god, it was a bloody trash bag that sat outside the window. This was followed by another which slammed the window again, and then another, and then another, and then another. And then, on the other side of the bloody handprint, I saw something that I'll never forget. Then, a final smack on the window. I saw a crack in the glass before hearing the loudest and most disturbing screaming I've ever heard in my life. I wish I had the words to describe it, but there is no way to describe what it was I heard. I tried my phone, keeping a close eye on the windows as I heard a slow scratching behind me on the outside of the station. Unfortunately for me, whatever was doing this killed the phone lines. The slow clawing made its way around the station and soon hit the window on the glass. I couldn't tell what it was in the darkness, but I could see the marks it was making in the glass. I raised my shotgun, and the moment I did it, it stopped. Everything fell silent except for the snow and the wind that blew it. I heard a crashing sound behind me and spun around, firing off shots, but finding nothing. It was as I was reloading that I heard the glass shatter behind me. Burst would be a better description, as it flew inwards as pieces of glass cut my skin. I fell to the ground and got up before firing a few more shots into the darkness. I heard nothing, and my adrenaline had me on edge as I was shaking. I wasn't shaking from the cold, I was shaking from pure fear. I heard a woman's laughter and then a man's crying. These sounds circled me and I kept an eye out. Whatever was there remained in the shadows. I was even more afraid now as I wasn't sure where this thing was. Were the voices, the crying, all of it real, or was it something inside my mind? I knew whatever it was, this thing was creating it. I heard that same inhuman scream behind me, at which point I spun around and fired off every round I had left in my shotgun before immediately pulling my Magnum out. There was a burst of disturbingly terrifying laughter that followed all of this. I've never heard anything so horrific in my entire lifetime. Things fell silent before a loud scream rang out ahead of me. I fired off a few shots and ran out the destroyed window in the direction of the screams. I didn't care if I died at this point. I just wanted it all to be over. I was sick of the sleepless nights and this thing toying with me, and so I fired as I ran until I heard clicking. I then reloaded as fast as my fingers would let me and shakily spun around in the snow, positive I was going to die at any moment. It was there I stood, shaking and crying until the sun came up. One of my coworkers arrived early for their shift and stood in shock at what they saw. They came to me and consoled me before driving out and finding a working phone. We called the police and I remember being in shambles. My mind was broken and I was afraid for my life. The worst part of it all was I never saw this thing. I gave the authorities my information and immediately took what I had in savings and moved away. My coworkers were able to help me find a transfer, and I now reside in California, where I'm getting ready to retire completely. Never found out what was going on, or what that thing was, or anything else in relation to it. I left the second I was able to, and I haven't been bothered by the thing since. Or whatever it was. I imagine it is native to Alaska. I have no clue what this thing was or how anyone is supposed to kill it, but I'm positive it is still out there somewhere, killing. I worked for the United States Forest Service in Texas for about 10 years. I love my job, and it's rare for anything particularly creepy or scary to occur. But having worked this job for so long, I have had my fair share of stories I can share that might just make the hairs on the back of your neck stand on end. For example, we sometimes get jaguars hunting in the forest here, a particularly scary big cat, and that's because of what they do with their prey once they caught and subdue it. So just picture the scene. You're walking through the trees on some bright, sunny day, when all of a sudden you start to smell something rotten. You look around, but there's absolutely nothing to be seen, just a picturesque view of the pines, and the sound of birdsong floating through the green. Then, something hits the top of your head. Something wet. You place a hand on top of your head, feeling something cold and slimy dribbling through your hair. You bring your hand down to see what it is, hoping it's not bird poo. Only, it's something much, much worse. It's blood. You look up, and hanging in a tree just feet above your head is a mutilated, half-eaten corpse of an animal. Guts torn out, skin shredded, face half-eaten with hooves or paws missing, with broken pieces of bone protruding from the cracked limbs. It seems like an utterly bizarre thing to do, but the jaguar has a good reason for doing all the heavy lifting. If a jaguar does not bother to hoist its kill into the tree, it risks losing its meal to another more ground-based predator or scavenger. Creepy, yeah, but that kind of natural world stuff is nothing compared to some of the other stuff I've encountered during my time in the Forest Service. So this other time, I'm on a routine walk through some of the trails to make sure all the directional signs and information markers for tourists are all in order. There's a large rock protrusion about 100 meters off of this trail, like this big sandstone boulder that just juts out of the earth and makes it look kind of like a shallow cave, carved out of one side that had been worn away from thousands of years of wind erosion. As I get close, I see a guy in what I first thought was camouflage hunting gear hanging around the entrance. I call out to him, just some friendly greeting, nothing threatening, and he turns to look at me. Only, he doesn't utter a word. He just seemingly runs off through the trees. I start getting worried about what he was doing in the cave, terrified he's left a body or something there, and honestly, I thank God that he hadn't, but it seems like he did leave something behind. I mean, I'm not even 100% sure it was him that did this, and I've often considered that possibility that it was him that happened to come across it first, and seeing me got the idea in his head that he thought maybe it was me that left that thing there. He got that idea into his head, saw me, and just freaked out and ran. But when I walked into that little cave and shined my flashlight around, I saw something that would completely explain why he was so quick to run away. Whatever his motivations were for doing so. Teeth. There was a little circular patch of dirt, one that looked like it had been raked over to clear some space, and in the middle of it all were a bunch of human teeth. I don't know why they were there. I don't know who left them, or why, but I did what I could. I gathered them up into a plastic bag I had on me, and it previously had my lunch in it, so don't think I just carry plastic bags, I'm not that weird. I took them down to the nearest police station, giving a little description of that guy that I had seen run from the cave. I've got the usual wild animal encounters, weird noises during the night, etc. But I've never forgotten about those teeth. I have no explanation to offer up at all, but it certainly does make for a good little campfire story. Everyone I know calls me Big Jim, so feel free to identify me in that manner. I work in Alabama, and I've been with the park rangers for almost 2 decades. My story involves what I believe to be a Bigfoot. I spend a great deal of my time simply wandering the majestic beauty of our parks. I am often on my feet, and while I do other things like help local wildlife and repair things, etc., most of my time is spent simply monitoring and surveying the land. During these beautiful walks in nature, I have a lot of time to think to myself. While working one April afternoon a few years back, I saw something hiding out in the trees. I initially thought it was an animal of some kind, but shortly after, I heard a loud sound. I guess you could call me a Bigfoot enthusiast in my free time, having sworn I saw these things multiple times in my life now. So, when I heard the familiar call, I believed right then and there I'd had another Bigfoot sighting. I took my time and very carefully moved closer, but as I got closer, I stepped on a branch, and at the sound of the snapping, the Bigfoot dashed out of sight. Now, this isn't the only sighting I've had. I was working a few years after this when I heard several big feet out in the wilderness. I know how that sounds, but I just wanted you all to know, they're definitely out there. Also, I don't know if big feet is the right plural for Bigfoot, but, you know. I was patrolling the area, and I heard a couple talking to one another, if that makes any sense. It is the same exact calling they are known to emit. We've had several locals in the area who have also spotted these things. I actually wish I could explain away any of this with some amazing thing, but I'm not much of a tall tale teller, and it has become so normal to me. I have such a strong belief in Bigfoot that it just seems natural and not some extravagant thing. The most interesting sighting I think I've ever had was while working in October of 1998 or maybe even 1999. I'm not entirely sure which year. My memory isn't what it once was. I was actually with one of my trainees when we heard something walking in the distance. I didn't think much of it and actually made a joke, saying, "Uh-oh, watch out, Bigfoot." A few moments after saying this, I heard that calling again. I remember laughing and saying it really was a Bigfoot. At first, the rookie laughed as well, but sure enough, a few moments later, there it was standing only a few feet away from a clearing. Now, keep in mind, this was before camera phones existed, and I didn't even have a camera on me. I remember having a big ol' smile on my face as I watched this thing. Shortly after all of this happened, it just turned around, called out one more time, to which we heard another one in the distance, and it waltzed off. So, if you're ever in Alabama, keep an eye out and maybe you'll spot a Bigfoot. If you live there, there's definitely a strong chance for sure that you've already seen one. In 2016, my husband and I went camping in eastern Pennsylvania. The place we decided to stop for the night was a primitive campsite. Camping was free, with no cell service, barely a road, etc. We did encounter 2 other people. Now, before I go any further, my husband was a forest ranger at the time, so we were not newcomers to the woods by any means. Anyway, these people we met might not factor into what happens later at all, but they were creepy, so I'll describe them. The first was a woman who had her truck off to the side of the road, just a little bit as we drove past. She had the hood open and seemed to be waiting for someone to stop and offer help. Usually my boyfriend had no problem helping someone, but he said this time something was putting him off about her. She didn't really seem like she needed help, and usually people who needed help would look at you hopefully as you approach. She looked like she just expected we would stop. That's what my boyfriend said anyway. I hadn't really noticed anything strange about her. The next person came when we had chosen a spot and were setting up a fire for hot dogs. I had noticed people drive by a few times, but my boyfriend pointed out each time it was the same car, and the man in the car watched us each time as he passed. My boyfriend was a little uneasy about this, but we had driven around for a while before finding a place we liked. It had been raining, and everything was muddy, and we wanted the driest site possible. He could have been doing the same thing, I guess. We briefly thought about moving out, but the road was too muddy. But the road was muddy too. If he wanted to find us, all he had to do was follow our tracks realistically. There were some other tracks, but not too many, you know? He'd only have to backtrack a little to locate us again. He didn't come by another time, so we stayed and spent several remaining hours before getting dark, goofing off. No one else drove by, at least that we noticed anyway. Whether or not those two had anything else to do with our experience is really to be seen. The real fear came later. We had gone to sleep in our tent sometime around 3 a.m. We were woken up by this very loud noise. I can't describe it very well, or even remember exactly what it sounded like, but my boyfriend said it reminded him of a chain gun revving up. It was also similar to how it would sound if someone recorded a shovel being dragged over gravel and played it over a loudspeaker. That's another way he described it. He jumped up and looked out the window, but couldn't really see a thing. The sound repeated itself a few more times. I was so scared, I couldn't even speak, so my boyfriend whispered that it was probably miles off and I should go back to sleep. I didn't question this, as I figured loud sounds could easily be heard miles off. After we left, he told me it sounded like it had actually been coming just down the road, but he didn't want to freak me out. Looking back, I probably should have wondered why he would have bothered to even whisper if he apparently thought the sound was far off. I was still terrified though. Every little thing I heard outside sounded like someone was walking around the tent. We laid there for a while longer when finally my boyfriend told me to get dressed because we were leaving. I got alarmed by this, and even more alarmed when he unwrapped the machete he had brought with us. We quickly packed up the car. I looked around for footprints that weren't our own, but despite the moon providing plenty of light, I couldn't really see. I did point out something my boyfriend hadn't noticed though before we got into the car. There was a beer can by our dead fire that hadn't been there before. We didn't even bring beer. While we were driving away, my boyfriend explained that he was nervous someone might have been trying to lure us out, so he didn't think it was a good idea to run from the tent right away. He also half expected to find our gas tank had been siphoned out, but that wouldn't have stopped us being we had a hybrid car. We joked that would make a hybrid car commercial very funny. A number of brutal murders avoided by driving a hybrid. We only joked because we were about to poop ourselves from fear and adrenaline. For the rest of our trip, we only stayed in well-populated campsites, or got a hotel. Out in the parks of Montana, we've had a few people go missing in the time that I have been working with the Rangers. My name is Nate, and I'm going to tell you about these mysterious disappearances. I don't have any way of knowing why or how they are missing. I can only say they are missing, and it is rather strange due to circumstances. I'm going to keep this somewhat short, but these people all seem to go missing from the same area of our park. We aren't sure if they are being snatched up and sold into trafficking, as there are definitely some bad dealings that happen in this area, or if they are simply running away. In fact, we've never figured out anything in relation to these cases, as there seems to be nothing to go on. The earliest one I can remember was a 7-year-old girl who went with her family into the park, and never came out again. I remember the girl simply because she was a child, and as a dad myself, this makes things hit different. Police and our park ranger services certainly looked for this family, but it was as though they went into the woods and then simply disappeared. The second disappearance was a college-age couple. Just like the family a few years before them, they went into the woods and never came out again. There are a few people who claim they believe there's a cult operating out in the area, but we've never seen anything like that would verify the theory. I know stranger things happen, but it is a bit unnerving to think that people could just disappear like that. I often find myself pondering what happens to people who go missing, not just in our area, but in general. The third disappearance happened late at night in 2010, I do believe, if my memory serves me correctly. It was a rather fit man in his 40s who went into the woods and didn't come out again. Now, some witnesses in the area at the time did say they heard someone shouting for help, and they went into the woods toward the sound of the voice, but eventually, the voice faded out, and they never found anyone. They were the people who reported the man missing before his family came forward. The final disappearance, and probably the most disturbing one yet, involved a woman in her 30s who went out late one night, and much like the man who previously disappeared, she was heard screaming. Another man went into the woods and said he felt shaken and uncomfortable, and it was shortly after he found a flashlight that was later identified as having belonged to the missing woman. I believe something very dark is happening out there. The problem is, though, where is any real evidence of what happened to the missing? I've debated going into the woods on my off time and looking over the area at night myself, but I've never worked up the nerve. It is pitch black out there and absolutely terrifying. I know this story isn't super disturbing, as we have no way to know exactly what happened to these missing individuals, but it is something I wanted to share, if for no other reason than as a warning to always be careful, even in state parks, if traveling off the beaten path. My cousin is with the Forest Service in the Montana-Wyoming area, and I decided to go up there with her to pretty much test the waters. She does hydrology and has to ride out in the middle of nowhere to test streams and snow runoff to ensure no contaminants are there. So I thought that sounded like a bit of fun and wanted to do a bit of a tour with her. We were going to go camp out there for 2 nights, so we packed up all of our gear in saddlebags or saddle bundles and started out. The first day and night was amazing. Beautiful scenery and amazing air quality. It really is so peaceful out there. I love that this area is just so serene, and I wish I got to go up there more often. Anyway, we started out on the second day, and my cousin said, "You want to see something weird?" Of course I said yes, so she led me on a bit of a side journey into this tiny little ravine. We ended up traveling about 2 hours from the actual path we had laid out. At the very end of this fold in the land, she dismounts and tells me to get off my horse. We tie them up in this gorgeous little clearing, and she tells me to follow this tiny wildlife path and bring our little rechargeable radio. It is one of those you can plug in and wind up. And it also acts as a lantern if you really need it to, but that kills the batteries fairly quickly. I bring it, and out in the middle of freaking nowhere, there is a huge coil of wire sticking out of the ground. The wire itself was not weirdly large, like some buried transmission wire, but small, like 10 or 12 gauge wiring for a house. It trailed off into the brush and trees, so naturally, I decided to follow the thing out of curiosity. My cousin trails behind me as I do, and this wire, after coming straight up from the ground, is strung across limbs of trees, then back to the ground. Then it snakes around rocks and finally dead ends into an outlet. The outlet is mounted into the side of a desk. It looks like a school teacher's desk from when I was growing up, with a metal base and a pseudo wood plastic top thing. There's no chair, no building, no nothing. Just this outlet and this desk. I am staring confused as hell at this desk in the middle of a forest when my cousin takes the radio, pulls the cord, and plugs it into the outlet. That thing lit up and started blaring static. The wire was being fed from somewhere. Now, the place where we have had no road access, no buildings for miles, and no other people around it, somehow had a live outlet. It may not be the scariest thing I've ever heard, or maybe you've ever shared, but it was weird as hell. I wasn't a forest ranger at the time, but I would become one. I used to be in a group that's somewhat like the Scouts, so we spent a lot of time in the woods and some weird stuff would happen, but most of the time, it was pretty easy to explain. One thing happened though, that to this day scares the living crap out of me. I was the leader for the age group of 8 to 10-year-olds, and we were out on a camping trip. It was the first year we stayed on the terrain, and it was huge. Normally we tend to explore the majority of terrain before the kids arrive, so we were aware of any possible dangerous spots to avoid. This time though, it was impossible. Every camp we have what we call a night game. It's usually a scary game in which the kids have to complete several tasks while the leaders scare the ever-loving crap out of them. Obviously, we had one during this camp. We masked up as monsters and hid out in the woods close to the checkpoint they had to pass. While running in between checkpoints, I found an open stretch of forest with little to no foliage, so it was ideal for chasing them. There was no real room to hide besides trees, so I couldn't use my flashlight or they'd be able to see me from miles away. It was dark, like the unsettling kind of dark that plays tricks on your eyes, and you start imagining things that aren't real. During my stay there, I saw a shadow that was around my size running past me quite a few times. I couldn't see it all that well, so I just assumed it was probably my imagination. Eventually, I turned on my flashlight and I just had to make sure there was nothing there. I didn't see anything. The game was nearing its end, and I saw the shadow again. This time I could see it vaguely standing near a tree not too far away from me. I thought it was one of the other leaders hiding there to scare kids, and decided to go over there, as it was about time to go back. I aimed my flashlight towards the tree. While getting closer, I noticed that there was indeed someone standing there, dressed in what looked like a torn burlap sack, and had their head covered with a few white plastic bags that looked like they were tied together. I started to feel pure dread. Something felt incredibly off about this person. I asked if everything was okay, but they would not respond. The only thing I heard was this weird sound that sounded like someone knocking on wood. Nevertheless, I went a bit closer until I was about 10 meters away from this person. The knocking sound turned out to be that person smacking his head repeatedly into the tree, and I noticed that this person looked to be a male. He was barefoot, and his arms and legs were covered with crusted mud. His hands were in a weird cramped position. I was convinced this was just one of the other leaders pulling a prank, so I told them to knock it off, you're freaking me out. He slowly turned his head and started walking towards me. Something inside me told me to run. It didn't matter if I was, just being pranked. I ran away scared, as fast as I could, running for my life. If this wasn't a prank, it felt like I was in serious danger, so I ran as fast as I could. I heard him running after me, but I didn't want to turn around to look as I'd probably run into a tree or something. I arrived back at the campsite and every single person that could be dressed like that was already there. They couldn't have gotten there before me, and if they did, they sure as hell didn't have the time to change into their regular clothes. Still, I told them that they gave me a good scare with that. They all just looked at me weird, thinking I was trying to scare them, and we left it at that. The next day I wanted to go check it out. Who knows, maybe some weirdo ate the wrong mushroom and might have been out there dying from hypothermia. I took someone else with me in case there was nothing but endless trees. We arrived at the tree where I saw the person banging his head. There was a dead, skinned, decomposing rabbit nailed to the tree. We called the cops. They looked around quickly and brushed it off as just a prank from another scouting group or some kids from the nearby town, and left it at that. We didn't notice anything weird after that, so it probably was a prank. But seriously, some people have a really messed up sense of humor. I was the lone forest recreation ranger in a smaller district in southern Idaho. The nearest town from the guard station was probably about a half an hour away by car. After moving into the guard station, solar power was not working that day for some reason. I hadn't slept for about a month due to various factors. Bats in the cabin, something walking on the deck at night. The woods were always eerie feeling, unlike the southwest Ponderosa forest that I was used to. About 2 months into the seasonal job, I started to hear something walking and scratching on the deck at night, perhaps even on the door itself. Now this district was known for its badgers and beavers, so at first I really didn't think too much of it. When leaving the cabin at night, I always had an eerie feeling like I was being watched. One night, I was returning from my grocery run. I always went on Tuesday nights, and I had a bad feeling in my gut. Now, at the time, I did not have my shotgun in the vehicle, which I would later come to regret. After stepping out of the vehicle, I looked to the right of the cabin. About 50 feet from my front door, all I could see were two eyes about 3.5 to 4 feet in the air. To say I freaked out was honestly an understatement. I started yelling, "Get the heck out of here!" But the eyes only crouched down an inch closer to me. At this point, I could tell it was a large animal of some kind, and definitely not a coyote. I tossed a piece of firewood in the general direction, and the creature leaped back a bit, but did not make a sound. I tossed 4 or 5 more pieces, and the creature still inched forward. At this point, I fumbled with the keys, and of course, the freaking solar power was out again. I managed to get inside and grab my shotgun. Technically, you are not supposed to have guns in government housing. But who the freak lives where the hills have eyes are, backcountry, and does not carry? I went outside. The creature was a bit closer now. I still could not get a good look with my crappy headlamp. I loaded my shotgun and continued to throw pieces of wood with one hand. Finally, the creature walked back into the brush. That night I drank about 4 IPAs and slept with my shotgun in my hand. In the morning, the trail crew came up, and we found mountain lion tracks all over the porch, rocking bench, and compound leading back to the creek. After that event, I always heard the rocking chair move and someone or something walking on the porch, but never found any tracks after that point. Considering that it was always muddy up there, and it was weird not to find any tracks, I've been stalked by mountain lions before, and never had that eerie feeling like I did in those woods. This happened about 3 months ago. Me and my family went up to visit Fort Necessity. I get that this story isn't probably the scariest thing you've ever read, but it freaked me out in the moment. So let's begin. We pulled into the parking lot, then we got out. My mom and I went up to the visitor center. It was closed at the time, so I looked in through the windows. My mom and my brother, I think, did the same thing. Then, out of seemingly nowhere, this guy appeared. He opened up the door. We stepped back. "Sorry, we're closed, but we're going to be opening Friday," he said. Then he gave us maps. I think he was a park ranger. At first, I thought he was a security guard because he had on a gray-like police shirt. My dad was a jail guard, and it looked a lot like his uniform. He had light brown pants on and a brown ranger hat on. He pointed us where the fort was. My mom said thank you and off we went. After we looked at it, we went back up towards the visitor center. There was the ranger walking down the trail. We were close to the top of the trail. "Hey guys," he said. He asked if we had any questions. We all said no, and then started talking about different areas and something about a turnpike. Then he asked a question. I don't remember what it was about, but I answered it right. He was so happy. Then he started looking up and down my body. He eyed me up and down. Then he told us about Washington Tavern. He told us we could walk up the trail there. Of course, we started walking up a different trail. The ranger went walking down towards the fort. We didn't walk that far before we could see the fort. It was like 70 feet away. I looked at it. There was the ranger. He was standing on top of the house inside the fort, or whatever it was. He waved at us. I turned my head away. When I looked back, he was gone. I didn't really say anything or think much of it. This was the part that really freaked me out. Then we came to a trail that led up a rough hill, but it wasn't like much of a hike, really. When we came to the Washington Tavern, my uncle and my parents were there talking and reading about it. I went up to a window and I looked inside of it. There was a table, and guess what I saw? The ranger was inside of there, and he had a creepy smile. I ran back to my parents. Then I went back up to the window. He wasn't there anymore. We started walking back down the trail. We got down towards the trail, and there he was again. He started talking about a junior rangers program. He looked at me and my younger brother when he talked about it. And then he told us about this picnic area not far from here. He told us the directions. As we walked away, I saw him staring at my butt. We got to the visitor center. The ranger was there and he pointed us to the road we should take. I started saying how weird it was that this guy was everywhere. I started making fun of him. I swear to God he turned his head like he could hear everything. But we were near the car, so how would he be able to hear me? We of course drove up to the picnic area. My mom pointed out signs warning us about bears. We were walking towards the edge of the forest and my uncle heard something. It was a growl. Oh man, it might be a bear. My uncle stared into the woods. Then he picked me up and he started running. I looked behind him. There was a bear, and this bear was huge. I think it might have even been running after us. Luckily, we weren't far from the car. We all got in and drove down the road. When we drove past the visitor center, everyone was talking about how we just saw a bear. I turned and looked out my window, and I saw the ranger standing outside the visitor center. It looked like he was covered in blood, and he had claw marks on his arm. It looked like it was from a bear. He waved at me and held up a sign, and he read, "Never talk bad about the dead again." I just waved back, and a few days after that I researched the area, and it said a ranger had died by saving a child from a bear, and that was about 7 years ago. To this day, I don't know what to think. I'm very sorry for making fun of a man who died saving somebody's life. Maybe he just wanted to save mine. My name is Jim. Most just call me Jimbo. I live in Pennsylvania. I am retired now, but I used to be a park ranger in the 80s and the 90s. My favorite part of my job was simply observing the natural beauty of our state. A big chunk of my time was spent simply surveying the wilderness and watching nature while I patrolled the parks I worked at. On one such patrol in September of 1992, I came upon a tree with some deep markings. I would have thought it was a bear or something like that, but the marks were just so far spread apart. They were deep claw marks from a 5-fingered animal, or thing of some kind, that burrowed near halfway through the tree itself. This was strange, but it wasn't something I was thinking too hard on at the time. No. Instead, I continued my scenic tour through our beautiful countryside. In case you can't tell, I love nature. It's beautiful. Even in my retirement, I still go out and walk the parks and just take in the beauty of our lovely country. The farther away from people, the better in my opinion. I say this as nature has a natural beauty in my opinion. It's one that simply isn't inherent in big cities with lots of noise. I'm getting off track though. I continued for the rest of my day thinking nothing much of the markings I had found. By the next morning, I was rearing and ready to go up and go to work. When I stepped outside my home though, I found something strange on my property. To help you understand just a bit better, I live in the country, partly why I mentioned my disdain for cities earlier. I have a decently sized property. Anyway, I stepped outside and found some sort of mark on a tree near my home. It was just as deep, and it made me do a double take around the property in my area. I found no strange signs or weird marks. It was just on that tree. Part of me wondered if something had followed me home. But then again, I'd seen nothing but claw marks, and I was never one to let my imagination get the best of me. As such, I drove to work and once again forgot all about the markings. Upon arriving at work, I found sheriff cars roaming the park. I asked if I could help the lawmen, at which point they asked if I was in charge. I nodded and mentioned I was, just about to start my shift, and was asking what was wrong. It was then that I was told some very disturbing news. Someone who had been camping in the area was on their way out, and they found a dog torn to shreds. I asked if they could show me. I have always had a strong stomach, and they brought me over to a very horrible sight. A dog had its insides torn out and looked completely mutilated. It had several claw marks that seemed to run through its entire body, and much of the body was in pieces. It was such a terrible thing to see, to say the least. Law enforcement then asked if I had seen anything strange around the parks as of late. I mentioned the claw marks I had seen the other day, but I also said I had seen nothing more. They told me to keep an eye out as they believed some kind of wild animal was out there, and they were worried it could pose a threat to the public. I also got a number to call in the event that I saw anything else or found anything in the same manner as this poor dead dog. I told them I'd keep the number and I'd keep an eye out and move on to my morning duties. There was a strange air about this day. It was like any other shift, but something felt off. I'm not saying it's because of the way my day started, but the day just as a whole felt wrong. The best way I could describe it is there was a sense of foreboding in the air. About 3/4 of the way through my shift that day, I decided to go back to the area because I had a little bit of spare time. I saw those claw marks. I made my way back to the tree and looked around. I didn't find anything strange outside of the claw marks. I didn't notice any sort of footprints or paw prints or tracks. There was a bit of heaviness in the air, but I just chalked that up to the strange day I had. The remainder of my shift was quiet, and I quickly headed home once I ended work. I still remember the meal that night. A huge pot of lima beans and rice with some nice deer sausage. I went to bed that night very content with a nice full belly. Sleep is rarely as great as when you fall into a food coma. At least, in most instances. This night was not one of those instances. I crashed quickly, but I was awoken by a loud banging at my door. I got up, grabbed my shotgun, and approached the door. By the time I had reached the door, it was practically falling off its hinges. I had really had no time to process what was happening, and I was still half asleep, but I realized one thing. It wasn't good. I raised my shotgun without much of a thought and fired around through the door. The way I figured, it was someone trying to knock in my door, probably to rob me or something like that, and that meant they were on my land and had no right to be there, and every right to be shot. I live on private property, and I can assure you that you can't miss the many signs that read trespassers will be shot on sight. Upon this point, though, I'd never really met anyone stupid enough to test that. Now I figured, having blown a hole through what was left of my door, that someone was probably on the other side in pain and potentially bleeding out. The first thing I did was call the police. The next thing I did was try to open my door, but it was half beaten in and a bit warped. When I went to open it, the thing practically fell off. I was in shock because I thought whoever did that must have been quite strong. I saw the deep marks in the door. It was the same claw marks, and I went white with fear. I jumped back from my door and held my shotgun at it. I then waited for the police. They said it must have been a bear attack or something. I explained to them I had seen a lot of things in my lifetime, but bears don't leave marks like this. Still, I couldn't rule out it was some kind of an animal, so after filing a report with the police, I spent the rest of the night with my gun at my side while sitting in my rocking chair in front of the door. I didn't sleep a wink that remainder of the night. I can't say what time I was awoken, but I was shocked awake, and the trauma from it all began. If you've ever been traumatized, you'll understand what I mean. If not, just know it can screw with your head. When morning came, I called in for the day from work, got a new door, reinforced everything, and then spent the rest of the day snoring after eating a quick meal. When I woke up again, it was nighttime. I knew at this point I needed to try to sleep, or my sleep pattern would be screwed, and so I attempted to, but when I would be brought back to the night before, and I'd be hearing loud bangings and shots. It was then I'd find that nothing was there, and nothing went on. When I finally fell asleep, I was awoken the next morning to knocking at my door. It was one of my buddies and neighbors from several miles away who'd come to visit. I explained to him everything that had happened, and he brought up a story about something on his own land that had been eating his pigs. He was a farmer, and how one night he found himself firing at it. He said he wasn't sure if he had ever hit it, but the shadow of the thing must have been at least 12 feet tall. He hadn't seen it since, but a few others around town had heard some strange things, or had some odd run-ins with this creature. The town was pretty small at the time. It was a subject you simply didn't bring up. After my visit with my buddy, I tried to situate myself into a normal wake-sleep cycle again by spending the rest of my day attempting to relax with some reading and a bit of television. Day went by fine. I fell asleep relatively easily that night, probably from pure exhaustion. It took no time at all for me to wake to the sound of scratching on my walls. I listened more closely and I could swear something was slowly dragging its claws along the side of my house, and at times seeming to try to quickly scratch the walls. It was strange, but I got my shotgun and went to look around my windows. This didn't go well, however, as the moment I went peeking around, this thing appeared quickly in front of my window. Its face was just about the size of my window, and it snapped at me. When it did, it shattered my window and began to try to come into my home. I remember firing several shells into it and running upstairs to my bedroom, where I locked myself inside, called the police again, and reloaded my shotgun, ready for one hell of a fight. I was freaking out as I had heard this thing running through my place and trashing things. I heard it sniffing around, and once it hit the stairs, I swear I heard it leap over them in one bound. As if that wasn't scary enough, I could hear this thing smashing doors down all the while I waited in a corner, begging dispatch to hurry the hell up. Things got quiet before the sudden smashing of my bedroom door, which felt like it was a toothpick. This thing came in, and through the moonlight I could make out its massive size and some of its features. It looked like a dog or a wolf on two legs. It was at least 12 to 13 feet tall, and that was hunched over. It had these huge claws. Its teeth looked damn near the size of my forearm, and I remember shaking violently. I felt faint and terrified for my life. I huddled in a corner as this thing came closer. Then I heard a sound I will never forget. Sirens. They were loud and this creature turned for a moment, distracted by the sounds. I remember firing a couple of shots and trying to run. This creature took a swipe at me and missed, but charged me right after. I was hit with a heavy force and lifted from my feet and through my window. Now, the second story isn't terribly high up, but it definitely hurt when I landed. I remember rolling and the sound of my gun going off as it hit the ground next to me. The police rolled up and someone checked on me as I pointed toward the bedroom. When I heard a loud stomping and another window breaking, the last thing I remember was my shaking. I had peed myself as well, but you would have too if you lived through that. I kept repeating, "It's not a bear. It's not a bear. It's not a bear," over and over again. I wanted to stop saying it, but I just couldn't. I think I was in a mild shock. I stayed with family a few times over for a couple of weeks. Now I used paid sick time during this time and reevaluated my living situation. I ultimately decided to stay put. I wound up rigging up my home with every possible security measure I could afford at the time. I've never seen this thing again though. I'm not sure if it was the couple of weeks I took away, or the police ambush, or what stopped it from coming back. Maybe it simply moved on. Maybe I just got lucky. I'll never forget my experiences, so long as I live. My name is Kenneth, and back in 2012, in Utah, I had an odd experience while at work. I'm a park ranger. I was 32 at the time and really just getting away from my partying days. I loved my job and drinking, but after 30, it really begins to take its toll on you, so I had recently decided I was going to cut back on it immensely. I say this so you know, I wasn't drinking. Not that I would on the job anyway, but you feel me. I was in no way doing anything that would hinder my ability to perceive things around me or any of that. Long story short, I wasn't tripping when this happened. Anyway, it was just before lunch and I was patrolling the park and thinking about what I was going to do that weekend. I was excited because it had been a long weekend and I was pretty exhausted. We'd had a few run-ins with some less than cooperative homeless people the day before, and much of my work week had been spent doing some digging and some planting for a project we were assisting that involved the community. So, There I was, just walking and thinking, when I hear the strangest call. I'm still not even sure how to describe it, other than it sounded like something was calling out. Even that doesn't do the sound justice. Well, this caught my attention, so I went toward the sound. Everything grew quiet, and I was just about to let the whole thing go and turn back. I was hungry and it was almost lunchtime, when I heard it again, a little deeper into the woods. So, I decided I'm going to check into things and just go a little bit further into the woods. I walk a ways and then I see something, and at first I mistook it for a tree, but then it moved. Now, I did a double take before focusing. I tried to keep as quiet as I could, as I wasn't sure what I was looking at. I didn't want to put myself in any danger or shock whatever this thing was. That's when I heard that call again. It was loud and clearly coming from this tall creature. I got a bit closer and stopped as I wasn't comfortable moving any closer than I had gotten up to that point. I stared at this thing, and it began to move. It was then I realized it had very dark hair all over its body. From afar, I believe I had mistaken it for a tree, because it was so still, and the color of it was perfect to blend in with the trees around it. As the thing begins to walk away, I tried to get a picture, but I wanted its face, and for it to stay still long enough for me to take a picture. I shouted, "Hey!" and this thing turned. I lifted my phone up, and then just like that, it was gone. I don't know how to put this, but the speed of this creature was nothing I had ever seen. This was made stranger because it was so big. I looked around the area and couldn't find much. I believe it was a Bigfoot though. The size and the features seemed to line up. Now I figured this would be the extent of things and headed back to the station to get my lunch. I ate quietly. I kept to myself as I wasn't going to bring up Bigfoot to my colleagues, being I didn't get a picture of the creature. Still, some of my coworkers, Larry mostly, noticed I wasn't as talkative and asked if I was alright. I told him I was fine and just tired and ready for the weekend. My coworker left things at that, and after lunch I went back out to the area I was in before to see if I could find any footprints or anything. But it was fall, and there were a ton of leaves, so sadly I never found anything. All that aside though, I did hear that calling again. It was deeper into the woods, mind you, but it was definitely still out there. That was strange, I thought to myself, but before I knew it, I went to investigate again. I just couldn't help it. I was pretty curious, and also some part of me really wanted proof of what I had seen, if for no other reason than to confirm to my own brain that I wasn't insane. So I looked around and headed deeper within. I wanted a good shot if I got one at all. I didn't want a picture of something tall in the woods because I'm not joking when I say, this thing from afar looked like it could just be another tree. So I pursued trying to get a closer shot, and eventually I caught up to where the calling was coming from. I heard the calling. I heard it clear as day. The problem was I couldn't see anything this time. It was like whatever I was looking for was invisible. I know how that sounds, but I swear to you, something was calling from a few feet in front of me, and I could not see it. I remember how tall this thing was, and it seemed perplexing to me that something this tall could just vanish. The thought occurred to me that it might be camouflaging itself somehow. But the thing is, that wouldn't make it completely invisible, right? Being unable to see anything, I started to look for unlikely things. For example, I started looking up in the trees even though I knew, with the size of this thing, there was no way it was in the treetops. I looked high, and I looked low, and after a while, I stopped. I remember being pissed at myself because I felt like I had a chance to get undeniable proof for myself and potentially the world of Bigfoot's existence. I'm talking non-grainy, actual legit photographs, but no, I missed my chance. Perhaps I should have just taken a picture or taken a video immediately, but from afar, as I said, this thing blended into the trees, and even once I looked close enough, my mind was still trying to process what I was seeing. As I walked back, I heard the calling one more time, and I looked back, and that's when I saw this thing one last time. It stared at me for maybe a second or two, and then bolted off into the woods. It wasn't long enough for me to get my phone in position, and I kick myself to this day because in my mind, I could have definitely gotten proof. But retelling this tale, I know how it's going to sound. Still, I thought I'd share my experiences anyway. I hope if you read this, it will find well enough use. You may call me Lillian. I'm a park ranger out in Louisiana. I don't know how to set this up to begin to explain my experiences, but I'll just jump into it and let anyone who may hear this make their own judgments. My story begins on a crisp October morning in 2009, with a dog I'd found in my park. Now, this dog was motionless and I was worried about it, so I quickly jumped in to check its breathing. It didn't appear to be breathing. I was going to radio my supervisor about the dead dog I had found when I was suddenly blinded by a light from the sky. I couldn't move and seconds later it was gone. I was able to move and the dog had vanished. I tripped out, but what tripped me out more was when I checked my watch and realized it hadn't been seconds. I'd lost 2 hours. It was about lunch, so I headed back to the station and talked to my supervisor, who asked where I'd been. I told them I was patrolling the area and found an abandoned homeless camp and was cleaning up. They didn't really argue with me about this, and I went about the rest of my day fairly well. I was silently in shock still about my entire situation, but I tried to brush it off and finish my day, which for the most part went off without an incident. That night when I went home, I took a shower and then ate before crashing. That's when I had a dream, but I'm not entirely sure if it was a dream. I was on a table in this sleek-looking office. Everything seemed very sterile. I mean, this is how clean it looked. I was naked and cold. I remember a man, or what I thought was a man, walking in at the time. He stood over me and explained in a very calm voice that everything was going to be fine. He said they just needed some samples, and then I'd be placed comfortably back in my bed. Now, the man looked like an older man, but this changed over time. He injected me with something in the neck, and I began to hallucinate for a few seconds. I saw this man's face morph into an old man's face to a gray, humanoid, with big black eyes, and then back to an old man's face. I began to freak out, but then he spoke again and asked me to remain calm and that they were simply studying my DNA. He laughed and said if I had seen his true form he apologized, and that he assured me he meant me no harm. He said I should be proud that I'd be helping advance science with more studies on my people and the wildlife on Earth. I am not crazy. This is definitely what was said to me. He smiled once again, and at that moment, everything was done, if that makes sense. I felt an immense calm. The last thing I remember was a barking, and the calm voice saying it's okay, we've revived you. Then I passed out again. When I woke the next morning, I felt extremely relaxed. This isn't the strangest part of any of this, though. The strangest thing was I heard a scratching at my door. I got up and put a robe on before heading to the door. When I opened it, I fell over almost in shock. Standing before me, now barking, was a very happy dog. It wasn't just any dog, though. I can promise you. It was the dead dog I found the day before. The one that vanished in front of my very eyes. Now, if that wasn't strange enough, this certainly will be. I felt around on the back of my neck because seeing the dog made me remember the injection, and sure enough I found a small puncture spot. At least I could feel it, on the back of my neck. A little freaked out, I called in sick to work and made an appointment with my doctor. I didn't say exactly what was up, only that I wanted to get something on my neck looked at. I should also mention I did take the dog, and I named him Maximus. I still have him to this day, too. Anyway, I eventually went to my appointment later that week and had myself checked out. Anything that could be checked out, that I could afford to get checked out, I got checked out. My doctor ultimately never found anything strange in any test results or anything like that. You can call me Jay. I'm a female working for the Park Services out of Montana. I'm going to get to the point and say I saw something I can't explain while working. I know, pretty normal so far, right? The first time I met Anna was my first day on the job. I was having lunch and she walked right up to me and told me about her day and her granddaughters, and she just was the most wholesome human I had ever had the pleasure of meeting, and probably will ever meet in my life. I've been working for 10 years with Park Services, and every day since Anna has always joined me for lunch and brought cookies and just been the sweetest old lady you could ever know. It was 4 years ago when I had a day I still don't know how to explain. It started off nicely. I woke up amped up on coffee and excited to take on my day. It was a Friday, so I also had the excitement for the weekend motivating me. Anyway, I went through my day looking forward to lunch with Anna. At around lunch, I went to the usual bench I'd sit to meet Anna, and sure enough, she'd show up right at 12 on the dot. We sat and ate and smiled and laughed. She told me stories about her mother from when she was a child, and she asked me about my dating life. I laughed and told her it was non-existent. This was about 12:15. I remember this because she laughed and told me I was beautiful and I would find someone when the time was right. She started to say I was young, but halfway through young, she suddenly seized up and started to struggle, like she was having trouble breathing. I grabbed my coat, laid her down, and called 911. I kept trying to reassure her everything was going to be okay, but I felt myself crying at the same time because I am so sure that I wasn't very convincing. Another thing that threw me off was that Anna was smiling. She seemed unable to breathe, but she was smiling. Shortly after, I heard a voice say she was going to be fine. It was a voice that was very distinct and very assured, but when I looked around, I saw no one there. I stayed with Anna until the paramedics arrived. As soon as work was out, I prepared my stuff and headed for the hospital. I tried to get in, but they weren't going to let me in initially as I technically wasn't family. They reassured me she had lived, and after talking to her, they finally allowed me in back after she said I was the only living family she had left. I remember feeling a welling of relief on the inside and also happiness, and I found myself crying again out of joy that my good friend was still on this earth. In many ways, I considered Anna like a grandmother to me. I went to her room and talked to her, and upon entering the room I was greeted with all too warm familiar smile. She laughed and said she'd be fine. Her first words to me were, "Jay, my dear, I tried to tell you I'd be fine, but I couldn't breathe." This was followed by laughter on her part, and I laughed too, but mostly out of the fact her laugh was so infectious. I didn't really find it funny, but I just was so happy at that moment. It turned out that she had a heart attack. The thing was, due to where it was, she should have been dead already. The doctors weren't sure how she lived, but I remember that voice that told me she'd be fine. It wasn't Anna's voice. There was no one around us at the time when it happened, and I'm sure I heard that voice. I could still hear those words in my head today echoing. I remember leaving Anna that evening with a smile, knowing she was okay. As I looked back inside the room through the window and the door, I saw someone there, standing next to her smiling. They looked at me, smiled, and faded before my eyes. I don't know how to explain any of this really. I'm not sure if what I saw was an angel or what, but I'm grateful my friend is still alive today, and I can't shake this feeling that whatever was in the room with her is the reason. I still have lunch with Anna today. I'm grateful for every second on this earth that I have with her. My name is T. Well, my real name is Tad, but I've never liked the name, so I just go by T. I work for the Park Rangers in Arizona. My story is really short and sweet. I followed a dog out into the desert. This dog looked hurt. It hobbled on 3 paws and kept running away when I tried to get to it. Being the animal-loving and worried soul I was, I went back to the station and got a truck. I didn't want to be stuck out in the desert without a vehicle, water, and food, and anything I'd need in case I got stranded somehow. I also let my supervisor know where I was headed and why. He wanted to come along as well, and so I allowed it. I think part of it may have been boredom and part of me obviously wanting to have somebody for safety reasons. Well, we drove out quite a ways, GPS and all in hand. We were incredibly safe about everything. So no, this isn't a story about getting stranded out in the middle of the desert or anything like that. No, this is about this dog. After quite a bit of driving, I found it again. I thought it should be easier to keep up with now that I have a truck. It was on the edge of a dune, and so we continued to give it chase. When we crested the dune, we found the dog had already made its way quite a ways ahead of us, and so we continued following this dog. Now, when we finally got close to it, we were getting ready to get out of the truck and help the dog, but it barked at us and hobbled forward. I was confused. I decided we should follow it for a little while longer. We followed this dog for another 20 minutes or so until we finally crested a hill and looked down below to find a truck that had steam pouring out of the front and a man passed out in the sun. We immediately got down and helped the guy. The dog was licking the man. He was barely conscious, and we tried to get him a few sips of water. We then called 911, and someone got there pretty quickly. When they arrived, they rushed the man to the hospital, and over the course of a few weeks they were able to nurse him back to full health. We talked to the man, and I remember him thanking us profusely for saving his life. I remember asking the man what his dog's name was, and he said it was Teddy. I told him to thank Teddy as he was the one who got us our attention and led to him. The man's name was David, and we still keep in touch today. Always love your four-legged friends. You never know when they'll show their love for you by saving your life. I know this isn't the longest story, but I thought it was a sweet experience, and it isn't every day you run into a dog that leads you to a rescue mission. Park rangers see some crazy stuff. As always, I don't think that's ever gonna change. This series is truly probably the strangest one on the channel. If you enjoyed these stories, please be sure to hit that like button as it really does help me out a ton. If you're new here, why not join us? Hit that subscribe button and turn on notifications so you don't miss a new video. I upload them almost every single day, and all things natural and supernatural. If you yourself have a story that you would like to share in the swamp, be sure to send that in at swampdweller.net or the email you can find in the description down below. I'd love to share your story with everyone here in the swamp. It's stories like yours that help keep this show going. I'd love to know down in the comments below which story was your favorite tonight. I think that last one might be mine. I love a good dog story, especially when the dog doesn't die. If you're not aware, you can download your favorite Swamp Dweller scary stories on iTunes, Spotify, Stitcher Radio, and just about everywhere else you find podcasts online. Thank you guys as always for supporting the swamp the way you do. I'll see you guys soon with another creepy video.